He was the king of the underworld, a man whose name inspired fear and admiration. Al Capone. But who was really this gangster whose charm won over the masses, while his crimes shook all of America? In this video, we uncover little-known secrets about his rise, his family, and the biggest mistakes that cost him everything. What happened to his son? Was Capone truly an untouchable don, or just an ordinary man trapped in a world of crime? Welcome to our thing, and this is the story of the famous Al Capone. Stay with us until the end. Much has been written and said about Al Capone in newspapers, magazines, books, and films, but a lot of it is not true. One of the biggest lies is that, like many gangsters of his time, he was born in Italy. In reality, he was born in America and reshaped the feudal Italian criminal organization into a modern American crime network. Many Italian migrants, like migrants of other nationalities, often crossed the ocean with very little property. Most of them were peasants fleeing poverty and a lack of opportunities in rural Italy. When they arrived in big American cities, they usually worked as manual laborers because they didn't speak English and had no professional skills. That, however, was not the case with Al Capone's family. Gabriele Capone was one of the 43,000 Italians who arrived in the USA in 1894. He was a barber by trade and knew how to read and write in Italian. He came from the village of Castellano di Stabia, 25 kilometers south of Naples. Gabriele, who was then 30, came to America with his pregnant wife Teresa, who was 27, with their 2-year-old son Vincenzo and baby Raffaele. Unlike many other Italian immigrants, he didn't owe anyone for the cost of the journey, and he planned to do any kind of work until he could open his own barbershop. The Capone family moved, together with thousands of other Italians, to Brooklyn near the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Their new home was an apartment at 95 Navy Street, without running water and without an indoor toilet. The neighborhood was poor and undesirable because of the noisy shipyard, the many sailors, and the vices they indulged in while on leave. It was precisely his ability to read and write that allowed Gabriele to get a job in a store until he managed to open his own barbershop. Teresa, besides taking care of the ever-growing family, worked as a seamstress to contribute to the family budget. Their third son, Salvatore Capone, was born in 1895. Their fourth son, Alfonso Capone, the first conceived and born in America, was born on January 17, 1899. The Capones were a quiet, traditional family. His mother was shy and withdrawn, while his father made a stronger impression because he was tall, handsome, and very good-looking. Like his wife, he was quiet, even when it came to discipline. He never beat the children. He was against corporal punishment and raised them by talking to them. And they listened. There was nothing disturbed, violent, or illegal about the Capone family. Even the children and parents were close. There were no obvious mental disorders, nor traumatic events that might have pushed the children into crime. They did not display sociopathic or psychotic traits, did not inherit any tendency toward a criminal career, nor did they belong to a criminal milieu. They were an honest, average Italian-American family with conventional patterns of behavior and frustrations. They showed no special inclination toward crime or toward any other particular field. In May 1906, Gabriele became an American citizen. Within the family, his children were always known by their Italian names, but to the outside world, they were known by the American names they adopted. Vincenzo became James, Raffaele became Ralph, Salvatore became Frank, Alfonso became Al. Later children were Amadeo Ermino, later John, nicknamed Mimi, Umberto, later Albert, John, Matthew, Nicholas, Rose, and Mafalda. Shortly after Al's birth, Gabriele moved the family to a better home, to an apartment above his barbershop at 69 Park Avenue in Brooklyn. This move exposed Al to cultural influences far wider than those of the Italian immigrant community. Most people living around Park Avenue were Irish, but there were also Germans, Swedes, and Chinese. And just to add, you shouldn't confuse this Park Avenue with the luxurious Park Avenue in Manhattan. These are two completely different places. Moving into a broader ethnic environment allowed Al to break free from the closed world of a purely Italian neighborhood. There is no doubt that this experience would later help him in his future role as the leader of a criminal empire. 1 block away from their house stood the parish church of St. Michael, where Father Garofalo baptized him a few months after he was born. At the age of 5, in 1904, Al started public school Sutton on Adams Street. Educational opportunities for Italian children were very poor. The school system was deeply biased against them and did nothing to encourage interest in higher education, while immigrant parents expected their children to leave school as soon as they were old enough to work. Al did well in school up until the 6th grade, when his steady grades suddenly dropped. At 14, he lost his temper and got into a fight with a teacher. She hit him, and he hit her back. He was expelled and never went back. Around that time, his family moved from the house on Navy Street to 21 Garfield Place. This move had a lasting impact on Al, because in the new neighborhood, he met the people who would most influence his future: his wife May and the gangster Johnny Torrio. A few blocks away from the Capone home on Garfield Place, there was a small, inconspicuous building that served as the headquarters of one of the most successful gangsters on the East Coast. Johnny Torrio was a new kind of gangster, a pioneer in the development of the modern criminal organization. His administrative and organizational skills transformed crude racketeering into a kind of corporate structure, allowing his operations to expand as new opportunities appeared. From Torrio, young Al Capone learned invaluable lessons that became the foundation of the criminal empire he later built in Chicago. Torrio was physically small, but he learned early on the street that intelligence, resourcefulness, and the ability to form alliances were the keys to survival. He was a gentleman gangster, known as a racketeer, and secretly owned numerous brothels. He was a role model for many boys in the community. Al Capone, like many other boys his age, earned pocket money doing various jobs for Torrio. Over time, Torrio began to trust young Al more and more and gave him more tasks. At the same time, Al was learning by observing the successful and wealthy mobster and the men in his organization. Above all, Torrio taught him the importance of leading a respectable public life, of separating his criminal career from his family life, as if a calm, conventional family environment somehow justified or legitimized his work. It was a kind of hypocrisy that came naturally to Johnny Torrio and that Capone learned to respect. In 1909, Torrio moved to Chicago, and young Al fell under the influence of other people. Children growing up in immigrant Brooklyn belonged to various gangs: Italian, Jewish, and Irish. These were not the brutal urban street gangs we know today, but groups of neighborhood boys who hung out together. Capone was a tough, combative boy and belonged to gangs like the South Brooklyn Rippers, the 40 Thieves Juniors, and the 5 Points Juniors. For these kids, the street gang was escape and freedom. A street gang offered an outlet for pent-up youthful energy. Institutions that could have kept boys off the streets, like schools and churches, simply didn't have the means to do it. Few schools in poor neighborhoods had gyms, playgrounds, or any after-school programs. So they formed their own street society, independent of the adult world and in conflict with it. Led by some older, stronger boy, they chased excitement, shared adventures, mischief, exploration, gambling, theft, vandalism, and secretly smoked cigarettes or drank alcohol. They performed secret rituals, told dirty jokes, and fought rival gangs. Despite Capone's involvement with street gangs and Johnny Torrio, there were no clear signs that he would one day choose a life of crime. He still lived at home and did what was expected of him after leaving school. He contributed and helped support the family. The family was actually doing quite well under Gabriel's leadership. He now had his own barbershop, and Teresa continued having children, several more sons, and then 2 daughters, one of whom died in childhood. The only significant disruption in Al's peaceful family life came in 1908, when his oldest brother Vincenzo left the family and went west. At that point, no one could have imagined that this boy would become the criminal king he eventually became. For about 6 years, he worked hard at extremely boring jobs. First in an ammunition factory, and then as a paper cutter. He was a good boy, well-mannered, and very sociable. But he was a special kind of unremarkable personality, pleasant, quiet, and average in everything except dancing. Still, all of that changed when Frankie Yale came into his life. Originally from Calabria, Francesco Ioli, known as Frankie Yale, he was feared and highly respected. Unlike the peaceful and respectable Johnny Torrio, Frankie built his territory on force and aggression. He opened a bar on Coney Island called the Harvard Inn, and, on Torrio's recommendation, hired the then 18-year-old Al Capone as his bartender. Back when he moved to Brooklyn, Al had met a girl named May Josephine Coughlin. May was Irish by origin, born in Brooklyn on April 11, 1897. The two of them were very close and eventually started dating. Around the time Al began working for Frankie, May became pregnant. Albert Francis Capone was born on December 4, 1918, and his godfather was Johnny Torrio. Although Little Sonny, as he was called all his life, seemed fine at birth, he was actually a victim of congenital syphilis. Years later, Al admitted to doctors that he had been infected before he got married, but believed the infection had gone away. Al Capone and May were married on December 30, 1918, after she had given birth to their son, Albert Francis Sonny Capone. Interestingly, this wedding came at a time when Al was only 19 years old, although he was already known for being inclined toward crime. It is believed that May had a fairly stabilizing influence on him, at least in the early years of their marriage. With a beautiful and respectable wife and a baby to support, Al focused on a legal career. He quit working for Frankie and moved to Baltimore, where he worked as a bookkeeper for a construction company. Al proved very successful. He was smart, good with numbers, and very reliable. Quite suddenly, Al changed direction again when his father died of heart disease on November 14, 1920. At the age of 55, he renewed his connection with Johnny Torrio, who in the meantime had expanded his racketeering empire. As we already said, Torrio had left Brooklyn and moved his operations to Chicago. The opportunities were huge: gambling, brothels, and of course, illegal alcohol. Torrio called him from Chicago, and in early 1921, Al accepted the invitation. Armed with his business knowledge and experience with the brutal Frankie Yale, Capone had a good resume for a criminal career. Chicago was the perfect place to build a criminal empire. It was a chaotic city where alcohol and vice were part of everyday life. The city was open to anyone who had enough money to spend. It was a bloody and brutal city where tens of millions of cattle, pigs, and sheep were slaughtered, and workers literally waded through blood like in a slaughterhouse. Chicago was a purely commercial city with no respect for snobbery or old money. Political corruption, there was a tradition, creating an atmosphere of lawlessness in which crime simply flourished. The city became known for its wealth and sexual freedom. When Al Capone arrived in Chicago around 1920, human trafficking was becoming a domain of organized crime. The king of that business was Big Jim Colosimo, together with his wife Victoria Moresco, a successful madam. Their brothels earned around $50,000 a month, but it must be said that Colosimo did not build his position alone. His strength came from a district everyone called the Levee, where politics, the police, and the street intersected. Around him gathered people whose names rarely appear in the archives today, but meant a lot at the time. His lawyer was Rocco Di Stefano, and at his side stood Robert Vanilla and Lieutenant John Torrio, the man who would later succeed him. Behind the scenes was also the family of his wife, Victoria Moresco, whose contacts reached back to the old Camorra. It was through these connections that Morris Van Bever, known for white slavery, came to Chicago, and together with his wife Julia, he imported girls for brothels across America. It was said that more than 600 had passed through his hands, and Colosimo thus gained a national network and reputation he could never have created alone. All that allowed Colosimo not to be just a local pimp, but a player with national connections. It was said that through them, he had contacts with people in Newark and Italy, and that his kingdom grew with the tacit help of both the Irish and the Jews. Big Jim was the owner of Colosimo's Cafe, one of the most popular nightclubs in the city. No one cared that he was a pimp. That didn't stop him from socializing with the rich and famous, like Enrico Caruso and the prominent lawyer Clarence Darrow. Big Jim, with diamonds on every finger and belts and buckles decorated with precious stones, was the embodiment of kitsch and the gaudy wealth of Chicago society. As business grew, Big Jim brought Johnny Torrio from Brooklyn to manage and expand their empire. That turned out to be a very wise decision, because Torrio expanded operations without attracting attention. Unlike Big Jim, Torrio was a serious family man. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't swear, and didn't have affairs. Big Jim fell for a young singer, Ale Winter, who won his heart. He divorced his wife Victoria and immediately married the young singer. News of this reached Brooklyn, where Frankie Yale saw an opportunity to take over his empire. On May 11, 1920, Yale killed Big Jim in his own club. The first major mafia funeral in Chicago was simply spectacular. Colosimo was known as the city's biggest pimp, but his coffin was carried by 3 judges, a congressman, an assistant district attorney, and 9 Chicago aldermen. Eventually, the police caught the killer and arrested him in New York. However, the only witness, a waiter, refused to testify against Frankie Yale. Although Yale escaped punishment, his attempt to seize the empire failed. Torrio kept control over the large business he had built for Big Jim. Thanks to Prohibition, Torrio oversaw thousands of brothels, gambling dens, and speakeasies. Into this vast criminal empire, Torrio brought the 22-year-old Al Capone, who left his honest bookkeeping job in Baltimore. The new opportunities for advancement were much greater, but he was deeply bothered by the shame of running brothels. It was 1921, and at that moment Capone turned his back on honest life for good. Because of his business abilities, Al soon became Torrio's partner instead of his employee. He took over the management of Torrio's headquarters in the Levee, the Four Deuces. It was an illegal bar, gambling den, and brothel all in one. His brother Ralph soon joined him in Torrio's business. At this time, Al became close to the man who would be his lifelong friend, Jack Guzik. Amazingly, the large Orthodox Jewish Guzik family made their living through prostitution. The Guzik roots went far deeper than many thought. Old Max Guzik had come from Poland in the late 19th century and opened a cigar shop, but soon realized that real money was not in tobacco, but in voting machines and brothels. His sons Charles, Harry, Sam, and the youngest, Jack, followed his path. Harry opened the Blue Goose in 1904, a brothel that would soon land him in court on white slavery charges. Scandals followed Jack as well. Newspapers called him guilty in the disappearance of a minor girl, although he was acquitted in court. Their establishments filled with money, and behind the scenes stood women who helped them do it, Helen Torrio and Mary Degiak. proof that there was definitely a female cadre in this game. Despite indictments and arrests, the Guziks survived because they had protection in the police and courts. The nationwide scandals of 1912 and 1917 ended with only small clerks going to prison, while the brothels continued to operate. This is exactly why Al Capone would later trust Jack Guzik so much. Knew Jack was the kind of man who could close politicians' and jurors' eyes, and that without him the entire network would be very vulnerable. On the other hand, Jack Guzik was a devoted family man and treated Al like a younger brother. While Capone fought wars on the streets, Guzik guarded his rear bribing policemen, fixing juries and turning chaos into a stable business. He was the man who allowed Al to survive, no matter how much blood was spilled. Once again, Capone showed his ability to build connections outside the Italian community, just as he had done by marrying his Irish wife. Now his closest friend was a Jew. Capone's ability to form alliances beyond the Italian mafia would prove invaluable for his future, financially. Capone was doing very well and bought a house for his family in a respectable neighborhood. Into this modest house at 7244 Prairie Avenue, he brought not only his wife and son, but also his mother and other relatives, including brothers and sisters. To the neighbors, he presented himself as a used furniture dealer and tried to maintain the facade of a respectable citizen. Even though he made his fortune from others' weaknesses, social standing and respect in the community were very important to him. The deeper he sank into crime, the more he idealized his family, as if they were proof that he was not the monster the media portrayed. After Capone arrived in Chicago, several years passed with relative calm among the various gangs. However, reformer William E. Deaver replaced the corrupt mayor Big Bill Thompson. When Deaver took office, the process of paying bribes and corruption became much more complicated. Torrio and Capone decided to move many of their operations out of the city to the suburb of Cicero, where they could buy the entire town administration and police. Shortly after they opened a brothel in Cicero, Torrio sent his elderly mother back to Italy and left Capone in charge of the operations in Cicero. Capone made it very clear that he wanted complete control over the town. He installed his older brother Frank, a handsome and respectable man, as the main negotiator with Cicero's authorities. Ralph was in charge of opening a working-class brothel called the Wire Fence, while Capone focused on gambling and took control of the Hawthorne racetrack. Most of Capone's takeover of Cicero went without resistance, except from a journalist, Robert S. Johnson of the Cicero Tribune, who wrote about Capone's criminal business in every issue. His criticism threatened Capone's candidates in the 1924 elections. This situation escalated on Election Day. Capone's men kidnapped workers for the opposition candidates and threatened voters. When news of this spread, the Chicago police sent 79 officers armed with rifles to Cicero to protect the workers at the Western Electric Factory. Frank Capone, who had just finished negotiating a lease, was walking down the street when a convoy of Chicago policemen encountered him. Someone recognized him, and the police shot him. Officially, the police claimed it was self-defense because Frank supposedly pulled a revolver when he saw the officers with their guns drawn. Al was furious and responded with violence, kidnapping officials and stealing ballot boxes. One official was killed in the process. In the end, Capone won control of Cicero, but the price was high and haunted him for the rest of his life. Al Capone organized a lavish funeral for his brother. The flowers alone cost $20,000. That's about $360,000 in today's money. Although the funeral was luxurious, Frank Capone's burial had a completely different tone compared to Big Jim Colosimo's. At Frank's funeral, the only things heard were sobs. Capone managed to keep his rage under control for barely 5 weeks. Then a small-time criminal, Joe Howard, attacked his friend Jack Guzik after Guzik refused him a loan. Guzik told Capone, who found Howard in a bar and shot him after being insulted. Prosecutors tried to convict Capone, but couldn't because the witnesses were intimidated. Soon afterward, he became known throughout the city. At only 25, after 4 years in Chicago, Capone became a force to be reckoned with and a serious name in the mafia world. Rich, powerful, and master of Cicero, he became a target for both the police and rival gangsters. He was well aware that the next extravagant mafia funeral could be his. The fragile peace Torrio had built with other gangs broke down because of prohibition. Killings between gangs reached epidemic proportions. Although Al Capone's name was often linked with many murders, the truth is that many of them were carried out by other gangsters who Capone and Torrio tried to keep under control. One of them was Dion O'Banion, known for his growing bootlegging business and his flower shop. Dion never appeared like a brute. His habit of calling even his enemies good fellows reflected his cheerful nature. He always smiled, but his cold blue eyes betrayed his true character. He was tireless in his handshakes and backslaps, but he always kept one hand free to grab a gun from one of 3 specially tailored pockets. Dion was also known for his strange behavior, including killing a man in front of a crowd for trivial reasons, and later killing another man after a meeting at Capone's Four Deuces, which unnecessarily dragged Capone into a murder investigation. His irresponsible and impulsive behavior put the entire organization at risk, and something had to be done. There was also a conflict between Dion and the Jenna brothers, close friends of Torrio. The conflict arose when the Jennas started selling cheap alcohol to Dion's customers. Even though this didn't significantly hurt his beer profits, the principle was what mattered. The conflict escalated when Dion hijacked a truckload of liquor belonging to the Jenna brothers, which further complicated things for Torrio, who was still trying to maintain peace. Dion offered Torrio a way out. He proposed to retire to Colorado if Torrio bought his share in the Seaman Brewery. However, Dion knew in advance that the police would raid the brewery, so he arranged the sale just before the raid. Torrio ended up in jail, while Dion refused to return the money for the now-closed brewery, boasting that he had tricked Torrio and thereby sealed his fate. After the death of Mike Merlo, the leader of the Union Siciliana in Chicago, who died of cancer, a large funeral was planned where Dion, as a florist, played a key role. Frankie Yale, head of the powerful New York branch, agreed with Torrio and Capone that Angelo Genahum, Dion had recently humiliated over a gambling debt, would take over the Chicago branch. 2 days after Merlo's death, on November 10, 1924, Dion was in his flower shop preparing flowers for Merlo's funeral when 3 gangsters entered. Dion's employee left him alone with them. Dion thought they were there to pick up a wreath, greeted them, and stretched out his hand. One of the men grabbed his hand, pulled him closer, and shot him. The employee heard 6 shots and ran in to help Dion, who was lying in a pool of blood. The 3 attackers disappeared. It appears that 2 of the killers were ruthless Sicilian hitmen, John Scalise and Albert Anselmi. The 3rd attacker was either Frankie Yale, who was in town for Merlo's funeral, or Mike Jenna. None of the suspects was ever brought to trial. Dion's funeral was spectacular. The Chicago Tribune enthusiastically described every lavish detail. At the corners of the coffin stood pillars of pure silver, adorned with beautiful carvings. Silver angels stood at the head and foot of the coffin, heads bowed in the light of 10 candles in golden candlesticks they held in their hands, while the smell of incense hung over everything. About 10,000 people attended the funeral, while another 5,000 waited at the cemetery. 26 cars and trucks carried flowers, and 3 bands plus a police escort followed the procession. For Torrio and Capone, Dion's death was a reason to celebrate because they took over his territory and finally got rid of a dangerous rival. However, they were unaware of the consequences that would follow. While the police were confused about the killers, Dion's friend Jaime Weiss knew exactly who was responsible and swore revenge. From that moment on, Capone and Torrio constantly looked over their shoulders, fearing Jaime Weiss and another O'Banion associate, Bugs Moran. Jaime's real name was Earl Wojciechowski, but he shortened it to Weiss. The nickname Jaime stuck, and many thought he was Jewish, although he was actually a devout Catholic. George Moran, better known as Bugs, was a violent and unstable man whose nickname came from the fact that everyone considered him crazy. Or Buggy. Torrio feared for his life so much that he decided to leave Chicago for a while and went to Hot Springs, Arkansas. Capone was equally worried and took all possible security measures. Still, during the next 2 years, former O'Banion associates tried several times to kill Capone. Although he himself didn't carry a gun, as a sign of his status, he was never without at least 2 bodyguards, one on each side. He was never alone except in his own home. He traveled only by car, sitting between his bodyguards, with a trusted and armed driver named Sylvester Barton. He preferred to travel at night, and during the day only when absolutely necessary. In January 1925, 12 days after Weiss and Moran tried to kill Capone, Johnny Torrio returned to Chicago. He and his wife Anna had just come back from shopping when they got out of their car and headed toward their apartment. Torrio walked behind her, carrying bags, when Weiss and Moran jumped out of another car. Thinking Torrio was still in the car, they opened fire and wounded the driver. When they finally saw Torrio, they shot him in the chest and neck, then in the right arm and groin. Moran put a gun to Torrio's temple and pulled the trigger, but the bullet jammed in the barrel. In the hospital, Al Capone took charge while doctors removed bullets from Torrio's body. The hospital was a dangerous place for a gangster because of poor security, so Capone arranged his own protection, including sleeping in the same room on a cot to ensure his mentor's safety. 4 weeks later, Torrio shocked everyone when he appeared in court on charges related to the raid on the Sebin Brewery. This frail man pled guilty and was sentenced to 9 months in jail. In jail, he befriended the sheriff, who ensured there would be no more assassination attempts, at least while Torrio was behind bars, and he enjoyed the treatment of a protected prisoner. However, nothing was the same for Torrio anymore. He wanted to retire from the violent life and enjoy a quiet life with his considerable wealth. In March 1925, he summoned Capone to the Waukegan jail and told him he was withdrawing from Chicago's business and planned to live abroad. Torrio handed his vast holdings over to Capone and his brothers. He left him an incredible inheritance: nightclubs, brothels, gambling houses, breweries, and legal bars. Capone's power increased enormously. Shortly after he took over Johnny Torrio's empire, it became clear that Capone himself had changed. He became the central figure in Chicago's underworld. To emphasize his new status, he moved his headquarters to the luxurious Metropole Hotel. His 5-room suite cost $1,500 a day. His friendship with newspaper editor Harry Red convinced him that he should act as the public figure he had indeed become. "Stop hiding," Reed told him. "Be nice to people." And Capone began appearing at opera, sporting events, and charity functions. He became an important member of the community-friendly, generous, successful, and outrageously rich. Yet buying good publicity was only part of the game, maybe the first half. Political influence was the second, much bigger half. Almost every day he went to the complex that served as City Hall and the county building. He did his best to appear accessible, like a man who feared nothing. He was always impeccably dressed and quiet, just another political fixer taking care of his daily business. Capone's political talent, his desire to be seen in public, was a unique combination among gangsters. who usually avoided publicity. In December 1925, Al took his son to New York for surgery for chronic ear infections that plagued the boy. Al was very devoted to his only child, and the boy's poor health was always on his mind. Capone used the visit to New York to conduct some business with his old boss, Frankie Yale. The topic was the supply of whiskey, which was always in short supply because it had to be smuggled across the Canadian border. In Chicago, Capone had built his empire smuggling beer, over which he held a monopoly. Now he planned to expand into other kinds of alcohol. Yale could get whiskey in New York more easily than Capone could in Chicago, so they agreed to a deal. Yale invited Capone to a Christmas party at the Adonis Social and Athletic Club, a fancy name for a Brooklyn speakeasy. Yale had been warned that rival gangster Richard "Pegleg" Lonergan would crash the party with his men and wanted to cancel. But Capone insisted the party go on. Capone had his own plan. When Lonergan and his men arrived at the club around 3 in the morning, they behaved offensively and rudely. Capone gave the signal, and chaos erupted. Lonergan and his men didn't even have time to draw their guns. They were so surprised by the well-organized attack. The massacre at the Adonis Club was Capone's way of showing his power back on his old turf god. It was also a way to demonstrate the superiority of the Chicago mob over New York's. Early in 1926, Capone was in an excellent mood. Not only had he made a big impression in New York, but his whiskey deal had the potential to transform interstate transport. Young men hungry for adventure and money could make good earnings as Capone's truck drivers. However, his luck turned in the spring of 1926. On April 27th, Bill Max Wiegand, a young prosecutor known as the hanging prosecutor, because he had tried in 1924 to charge Capone with Joe Howard's murder, suffered an accident, in quotation marks. After leaving his father's house, an experienced Chicago detective, Max Wiegand, and his friend Red Duffy went to play cards in one of Capone's gambling joints. Bootlegger Jim Doherty picked them up in his car. When Doherty's car broke down, they continued in the car of Klondike O'Donnell, a notorious Capone enemy. The 4 young men of Irish descent went on a drinking spree in Cicero with O'Donnell and his brother Miles, ending up in a bar near the Hawthorne Hotel where Capone was having dinner. O'Donnell strutting around Cicero was an insult on Capone's territory. Capone and his men, not knowing that Max Wiegand was in the bar with Miles O'Donnell, waited outside in a convoy of cars. When the drunken young men came out of the bar, a hail of automatic gun fire followed, and the prosecutor and Doherty were left dead. Capone was immediately blamed. Despite Wiegand's tarnished reputation for hanging out with bootleggers, the public sympathized with the young prosecutor. There was a huge outcry against the mafia, and public opinion turned against Capone. Although all of Chicago believed Capone was responsible, there was no concrete evidence, and the failure of the investigation to bring an indictment was a major embarrassment for local authorities. The police vented their anger on Capone's brothels and speakeasies, which went through a series of raids and fires. During the summer of 1926, Capone hid for 3 months. Allegedly, about 300 detectives searched for him all over the country, in Canada, and even in Italy. In reality, he first found refuge at a friend's house in Chicago Heights, and then spent most of his time at another friend's place in Lansing, Michigan. Those 3 months in hiding left a deep mark on Capone. He began to see himself not only as a successful criminal, but as a source of pride for the Italian immigrant community. As a generous benefactor and important intermediary who could help people. His bootlegging operations employed thousands of people, many of them poor Italian immigrants. His generosity became legendary in Lansing. Although much of this was just inflated ego, Capone did possess real leadership skills and could direct those talents to benefit the community. He seriously considered retiring from criminal life. Still, he couldn't spend the rest of his life in hiding, so he decided to take a calculated yet risky step. He negotiated his surrender to the Chicago police. It was the first step in the new direction he wanted to take, clearing his name in the prosecutor's death, using his wealth to finance legal businesses, and presenting himself as a hero of the Italian immigrant community. On July 28, 1926, he returned to Chicago to face the accusations of murder. It turned out this was the right decision, because the authorities had no evidence strong enough to bring him to trial. Despite the public furor and all the efforts of the police, Capone was a free man, and the authorities, as always, were powerless. In his new role as peacemaker, Capone made one last attempt to reach a truce with Jaime Weiss. Despite Weiss's recent attempt to kill him, he offered a very lucrative business deal in exchange for peace. Jaime refused, and the very next day he was killed. He was only 28 years old when he died. Chicago citizens were sick of reading about gangster violence, and the newspapers were stoking their anger. Capone organized a highly publicized peace conference, appealing to other bootleggers to reduce the violence. There is enough business for all of us without having to kill each other like animals in the streets. I don't want to die in the street, riddled with machine gun bullets. His message resonated, and at the end of the meeting, they reached an agreement that there would be no more killings or beatings, and no revenge for murders already committed. For more than 2 months after that, no one connected with bootlegging was killed. In January 1927, one of Capone's closest friends, Theodore Anton, known as Tony the Greek, was found dead. Capone was hit hard by the murder of his friend and began thinking more seriously about retirement. He invited a group of reporters to his house and cooked spaghetti for them, just so he could announce his withdrawal. He was probably serious about it, but his need for power and excitement kept postponing that retirement. After Mayor Deaver's reform program failed, Chicago's rise as a gangster kingdom became the main issue in the 1927 election campaign. With help from large sums of money from organized crime, Big Bill Thompson returned to power. It seemed like the bad guys would have the city in their hands forever. However, a few small signs indicated that big changes could be coming in Chicago, in the bootlegging business, and for Capone himself. In May 1927, the Supreme Court ruled that bootlegger Manly Sullivan had to report and pay taxes on his illegal income. Even though reporting illegally earned money was essentially self-incrimination, it was not unconstitutional. With this ruling, a small special unit of the IRS Intelligence Division, led by Elmer Eyre, got the opportunity to go after Capone personally. Capone, unaware of this ruling and uninterested in Manly Sullivan or Elmer Eyre, became more extroverted and expanded his influence. He devoted himself to his two great passions, music and boxing. He became close friends with boxer Jack Dempsey, but due to suspicions of fixed fights, their friendship had to remain discreet. Capone, a lover of opera, extended his support to the world of jazz as well. By opening the Cotton Club in Cicero, Al brought in some of the best black jazz musicians of the time. Unlike many other Italian gangsters, Al did not harbor deeply rooted racial prejudices and gained the trust and respect of many musicians. He was very generous to everyone who worked for him, regardless of race. He didn't control people by shouting, force, or bullying, although the threat of physical violence was always present. Instead, he relied on their own desires and ambitions, making them feel valued, so they repaid him with absolute loyalty. And loyalty was exactly what Capone needed and demanded in the unstable circles where he moved. Loyalty really was the only protection from certain death. The greatest compliment people could give Capone was to call him a friend, which meant they were willing to look past his scandalous reputation. "Public service isn't my motto," Capone told reporters around Christmas. 90 out of 100 people in Chicago drink and gamble. I've tried to give them good liquor and honest games, and I'm not appreciated. Unknown around the world as a millionaire gorilla, media attention became a real annoyance, and when he traveled to the West Coast, the police shadowed him at every stop. As one Los Angeles detective said at the time, "We have no room for Capone or any other visiting gangsters, whether they're here on vacation or not." When Capone returned from the West Coast, 6 officers from Joliet greeted him with rifles pointed at him. "Well, I'll be damned, you'd think I was Jesse James. What's with all the artillery?" Back in Chicago, the police made life as difficult as possible, surrounding his house and arresting him for every minor offense. Because of this, Capone went to Miami, where the weather was much better than in Chicago in winter, but the local community greeted him coldly. He, May, and Sonny rented a huge house for the season and began looking for a permanent home. Through intermediaries, he bought a 14-room Spanish-style estate at 93 Palm Island, built by brewer Clarence Bush. In the following months, Capone invested a small fortune in renovating his new Miami palace, fortifying it like a small fortress with concrete walls and heavy wooden doors. The Palm Island estate attracted the attention of Elmer Irie of the IRS Intelligence Unit. He chose Frank J. Wilson to lead the work of documenting Capone's income and spending. The task was enormous. Despite Capone's lavish spending, all his transactions were done through third parties. And despite his incredible wealth, everything was handled in cash. The main exception was the very tangible evidence related to the Palm Island estate, which pointed to a huge source of income. At the same time, the government appointed George E. Q. Johnson, a member of the Scandinavian Old Boys Network in the Midwest, as U.S. Attorney in Chicago. Johnson was obsessed with catching Capone. In the spring of 1928, violence before the April election began spinning out of control. Johnson became the target of bomb threats, though it wasn't clear who was behind them. This time the targets weren't gangsters, but U.S. Senator Charles Deneen, a reformer, and a judge along with him. It was assumed that corrupt Mayor Bill Thompson was responsible, since the victims were his political opponents, but Al Capone, still in Florida, served as the convenient scapegoat. While May Capone spent the spring of 1928 decorating the house with the most expensive and luxurious details, Al focused on crafting the image of a respectable Miami citizen. Despite his outward image as an upright member of the community, Capone quietly planned how to deal with the urgent problems created by his old boss, Frankie Yale. After their agreement on supplying Chicago with whiskey, many of the shipments had been hijacked, and Capone believed Yale himself was behind it. Capone summoned 6 of his Chicago partners to Florida to deal with the powerful Frankie Yale. On Sunday, July 1st, around noon, Frankie Yale, with black hair and dark complexion, wearing a Panama hat and a light gray summer suit, was in a speakeasy in Borough Park when the bartender told him someone wanted him on the phone. What Yale heard on the phone was that he needed to hurry to his car parked nearby. Minutes later, on 44th Street, a black sedan forced him to stop. He was shot multiple times with various weapons, revolvers, sawed-off shotguns, and Thompson submachine guns. In the summer of 1928, Capone moved his headquarters to the once prestigious Lexington Hotel, taking over 2 floors of the large, imposing building. He lived like a potentate in his 6-room suite with a private kitchen to prepare meals to order. Secret doors were installed so he could slip out unnoticed if needed. Capone knew prohibition wouldn't last forever, so he began diversifying into other forms of racketeering. As in the bootlegging business, he faced an old enemy, Bugs Moran. Moran had twice tried to kill Al's friend and associate Jack McGurn. When Capone went down to Palm Island for the winter, McGurn visited him in early February to discuss the long-standing problems with Bugs and his North Side gang. Neither McGurn nor Capone suspected that the planned hit on Bugs Moran would become an event remembered decades later. Capone was relaxing in Florida at the time, making it hard to imagine he could be responsible for the killing of another bootlegger. Machine Gun McGurn had full control over organizing the hit. McGurn assembled a team of top men from other cities. Fred Killer Burke was the leader, assisted by a gunman named James Ray. Two key members of the team were John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, who had already been used in the Yale killing. Another participant was Joseph Lolordo, along with brothers Harry and Phil Keywell from Detroit's Purple Gang. McGurn's plan was creative. He arranged for a bootlegger to lure Moran's gang into a garage to buy top-quality whiskey at a very attractive price. The delivery was scheduled for around 10:30 a.m. on Thursday, February 14th. McGurn's men waited disguised in police uniforms, staging a fake raid. Like Capone, McGurn wanted to be far from the scene of the crime, so he took his girlfriend to a hotel to establish an ironclad alibi at the scene. The Keywell brothers spotted a man who looked like Bugs Moran. The hit squad put on police uniforms and drove to the garage in a stolen police car. Pretending to conduct a police raid, McGurn's men entered the garage and found 7 men there, including the Gusenberg brothers, who had previously tried to kill McGurn. Caught in the act, the bootleggers obediently lined up against the wall. 4 gunmen took their weapons and opened fire with 2 machine guns, sawn-off shotguns, and .45 caliber pistols. The men fell dead, except for Frank Gusenberg, who was still alive. To maintain the illusion of a police raid, 2 of the gunmen raised their hands and walked out of the garage in front of the 2 uniformed policemen, who were also McGurn's men. Everyone watching believed 2 bootleggers in handcuffs were being arrested by the police. The 4 assassins then drove away in the stolen police car. The plan was brilliant and flawlessly executed, except for one small detail. The main target, Bugs Moran, was not among the dead. He was late to the meeting and saw a police car approaching the garage, so he fled, not wanting to be caught in a raid. Shortly afterward, real policemen arrived at the garage and found Frank Gusenberg lying on the floor, dying from 22 bullet wounds. When an officer asked who shot him, he answered, nobody shot me." His refusal to identify his killers continued until he died shortly thereafter. It wasn't hard to conclude that the target of this carefully planned massacre was Bugs Moran, and that Al Capone was the one who would benefit from his death. Although he was in Florida and McGurn had an unshakable alibi, the police, newspapers, and people of Chicago knew who was responsible. But again, the police did not have enough evidence to prosecute Capone. And McGurn was smart enough to marry his girlfriend Louise Rolfe, known as the Blonde Alibi, who could not be forced to testify against her husband. Because of all that, the charges against him were dropped, and he was never brought to trial for this spectacular hit. The media attention around the St. Valentine's Day massacre was greater than for any gangster event before it. It was not only a local, but a national sensation. Capone became a national celebrity. Writers all over the country began writing books and articles about him. Never before had there been a figure like Capone. He was elegant, refined, a real phenomenon, and incredibly bold, continuing to live among the elite in Miami, professing his love for his family. He didn't look like a criminal or killer. He played the role of a self-made millionaire who could show those Wall Street guys how business was really done in America. Nobody was indifferent to Capone. Everyone had an opinion about him. Capone enjoyed his celebrity status and used writer Damon Runyon as his media agent. However, the damage from all that publicity was already done. It caught the attention of President Herbert Hoover. In early March 1929, Hoover asked his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, "Have you got that Capone yet? I want that man in jail." A few days later, Capone was summoned before a federal grand jury in Chicago, but he did not seem to grasp the seriousness of the powerful forces gathering against him, Capone believed he had more urgent problems. He had information that 3 of his Sicilian associates, Scalise, Anselmi, and Giunta, were causing trouble. He invited them to a meeting and prepared a lavish feast. At the head of the table, Capone sat smiling from ear to ear, his white teeth shining, radiating kindness as he toasted the 3 Sicilians. Long after midnight, when the last bite was eaten and the last drop of wine drunk, Capone pushed back his chair. An icy silence fell over the room, and his smile disappeared. No one else was smiling except the honored guests. Their belts and collars loosened, so their stomachs could bear the huge amount of food. As the silence dragged on, Betu stopped smiling and nervously looked up and down the long table. Capone leaned toward them. His words fell like stones. "So, you thought I didn't know? You thought you could hide the one insult I never forgive, and that's disloyalty." Capone had honored an old tradition hospitality before execution. The Sicilians were helpless, since, like the other guests, they had left their weapons in the cloakroom. Capone's bodyguards tied them to their chairs with wire and gagged them. Capone stood up holding a baseball bat. He slowly walked along the table and stopped behind the first honored guest. With both hands he raised the bat and swung with full force. He struck again and again, methodically, until he had badly broken the man's shoulders, arms, and chest. Then he moved to the next man, and when he had finished with him, he went on to the third. One of the bodyguards then took a revolver from the cloakroom and shot each man in the back of the head. This brutal event was another sign of how far Capone was willing to go to maintain control and eliminate any threat to his power. And then, although Capone didn't realize it right away, the St. Valentine's Day massacre and the enormous media attention that followed, some glorifying him, others calling for justice, pushed the government to take serious steps against him. Just days after taking office, President Herbert Hoover pressured Andrew Mellon to lead the federal battle against Al Capone. Mellon devised a 2-pronged strategy. First, gather the necessary evidence to prove tax evasion, and second, assemble enough proof to successfully prosecute Capone for prohibition violations. When the evidence was ready, Treasury agents would work with U.S. Attorney George E.Q. Johnson to begin criminal prosecutions against Capone and key members of his organization. The man in charge of gathering evidence of prohibition violations, that is, bootlegging, was Elliot Ness, who began forming a team of fearless young agents like himself. The main effort on the tax front was led by Elmer Irie of the Special Intelligence Unit, who doubled down on his work shortly after Hoover's order. Although there was doubt that Capone could be successfully prosecuted for prohibition violations in Chicago, no matter how strong the evidence, Mellon was confident that thanks to the Sullivan decision, the government could convict him for tax evasion. At first, Capone was unaware of the forces arrayed against him and did not allow such thoughts to distract him from business. In May 1929, he went to a conference in Atlantic City where gangsters from all over the country gathered to discuss cooperation instead of mutual destruction. To minimize violence and rivalry, they divided the nation into spheres of influence. Johnny Torrio became head of an executive committee that would resolve disputes and punish violators. Conference participants decided that Capone should hand over his Chicago crime kingdom to Torrio, who would then distribute it under his own terms. Capone, however, had no intention of leaving his kingdom or surrendering control to Torrio. After the conference, Capone went to a movie theater in Philadelphia. When the film ended, 2 detectives were waiting for him. Within 24 hours, Capone was arrested and jailed for carrying a concealed weapon. Capone removed his ring with an 11.5-carat diamond and gave it to his lawyer to pass on to Ralph. He was first taken to the Holmesburg County Jail, then to the Eastern State Penitentiary, where he remained until March 16, 1930. He left the running of the business to his younger brother Ralph. Jack Guzik and Frank Nitti, known as the Enforcer. Another blow for Capone came when his brother was charged with tax evasion in October that year. Federal agents wanted to send a message to other gangsters, so they led Ralph away in handcuffs from a boxing match. Elmer Irie, the persistent civil servant, had spent years investigating Ralph. Ralph was nowhere near as smart as Al when it came to hiding wealth and financial transactions. He was careless, greedy, and clumsy. He was a natural target for ambitious Treasury agent Elliot Ness, who tapped his phones, and for skilled tax agent Nels Tessum, who tracked every one of Ralph's financial moves. Nitti and Guzik also faced court because of these detailed, exhaustive investigations. With Al in prison and Ralph, Guzik, and Nitti weakened, Ness was tasked with gathering enough evidence about Capone's bootlegging operations to convince a grand jury that Capone was violating prohibition laws and dodging taxes. Ness's men constantly wiretapped Ralph's phones, using the information he gathered. With a truck fitted with a snowplow, Ness literally crashed through the entrance of Capone's brewery on South Wabash Avenue. Delighted with this bold approach, Ness and his untouchables continued raiding and shutting down Capone's breweries. In mid-March 1930, Capone was released from prison several months early for good behavior. A week later, Frank J. Loesch, head of the Chicago Crime Commission, compiled a list of public enemies headed by Alphonse Capone, Ralph Capone, Frank Rio, Jack McGurn, and Jack Guzik, close Capone associates. The list was published in the newspapers and soon became known as the FBI's Most Wanted list, thanks to J. Edgar Hoover. Thus, Al Capone, who wanted to present himself as a respectable citizen, became public enemy number one. He was furious, humiliated, and deeply offended. That same month, Elmer Irie traveled to Chicago to meet with Chief Agent Arthur Madden and devise a strategy to bring down Capone. Both realized they needed an insider in Capone's organization to achieve quick success. Before returning to Washington, Irie spent 2 days in the lobby of the Lexington Hotel, posing as a businessman. After he got a sense of the types of people living there, he came up with a great idea: find 2 undercover agents who would infiltrate Capone's organization by posing as gangsters. The logical choice was Michael J. Malone. He was a good actor, able to blend into any environment. He had nerves of steel and a very sharp mind. His dark, almost Mediterranean complexion and his ability to speak Italian made him an ideal candidate to infiltrate Capone's empire. Another undercover agent was chosen to be his partner in this risky operation. Malone took the name D'Angelo, and the other agent took the name Graziano. Great effort went into creating false identities for the two as small-time Brooklyn gangster racketeers. They knew every detail of their cover stories would be checked, and that their lives depended on how well they played their roles. Neither Graziano nor D'Angelo could be seen or heard talking to Irie or Madden, so they needed a go-between. The third agent in the operation was Frank Wilson, the 43-year-old star of the agency. Wilson would be the contact for Graziano and D'Angelo, coordinating the intelligence and evidence, and also doing part of the investigative work himself. In June 1930, Frank Wilson received permission from the eccentric publisher of the Chicago Tribune to question one of the newspaper's reporters. Jake Lingle was a friend of Al Capone and made no effort to hide it. Lingle was scheduled to testify on June 10th, but the day before he was shot in the back of the head, chaos erupted. Capone calmly watched everything from his Miami home. When asked about Lingle, Capone said, "Newspapers and newspapermen should be busy fighting racketeering, not supporting it. It's not for me to say, but that's what I think." Meanwhile, Agent Michael, now D'Angelo, checked into the Lexington Hotel, dressed in flashy, expensive clothes, and spent time in the hotel bar quietly reading the newspaper. Soon Capone's men approached him and began asking about his past. "We want the real truth about you," one gangster told him. "You look like you're on the run and may be open to some kind of proposition. Maybe we have something for you." Danshilo stuck to his cover and told them, "To tell you the truth, I am open to something, but it has to be good. If you want the real truth, I came here because I thought I could connect with the big guy." The gangster replied that they first had to check him out, but that he should stick around a few days, and they'd let him know. Dangello hoped he hadn't slipped up in his made-up story, because otherwise he'd be a dead man. A few days later, he was invited to meet the mob and Capone himself at a big party. Knowing that Capone could warmly welcome a traitor and then kill him with a baseball bat, Dangello went to the party with dread. Fortunately, Irie's careful work in creating the agent's identity paid off. Dangello became a croupier in one of Capone's Cicero casinos. Shortly before Ralph Capone's trial, Dangello learned that the mob planned to focus on government witnesses. This valuable information allowed Irie to organize extra protection for the witnesses, resulting in a conviction for Ralph and no harm to the government's witnesses. A few months later, Dangello was joined by Graziano, who got a job supervising Capone's beer deliveries. Just before Christmas, they uncovered a plot to murder Frank Wilson and stopped it in time. Now that Capone's organization knew who Wilson was, Irie wanted to transfer him, but Wilson refused. The attempt on his life only made him more determined to bring Capone down. The real intelligence breakthrough came when Graziano spoke with one of Capone's employees. "Those tax inspectors ain't so smart," the man said. "They've had All's books for 5 years now books." That could send him to jail, but they're too stupid to realize it. It turned out that among the mountain of documents seized during a raid years earlier at the Hawthorne Hotel was an accounting ledger documenting the financial operations of the Hawthorne smoke shop for the years 1924 to 1926. Now, they had to identify the 2 bookkeepers who wrote those entries. The handwriting didn't match any of Capone's men, and there was a good chance Capone had gotten rid of the bookkeepers once the books were seized. Graziano took a big risk and asked the man who told him about the books whether the bookkeepers had been taken care of. The gangster replied, "Not exactly taken care of, they were just a couple of dumb guys. But they left town 5 years ago when the place got busted. No big deal." Then the gangster revealed their names, Leslie Shumway and Fred Reyes. As 1930 drew to a close, Capone launched a big campaign to restore his image. He opened a soup kitchen for people who had lost their jobs in the deepening Great Depression. In the last 2 months the kitchen was open, it served 3 free meals a day. This effort was carefully calculated to rehabilitate his image and get closer to the working classes, who began seeing him as just another incredibly rich and powerful tycoon. In the early months of 1931, Irie's men tracked down Shumway in Miami, where he was ironically working at the Hialeah racetrack, a place Capone often visited when in Miami. Frank Wilson went to Miami to talk to Shumway and managed to leave the city with him just half an hour before a car full of Capone's men arrived looking for the bookkeeper. Fred Reyes was found in Illinois. Both men agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for maximum protection and safety. On another front, Elliot Ness was becoming increasingly successful in finding and shutting down Capone's breweries. He and his untouchables, as his team was called, impressively documented thousands of prohibition violations that could be used against Capone if a tax case somehow failed. Ness wanted not only to send Capone to prison, but also to publicly humiliate him. The murder of one of Ness's friends was the catalyst for his plan to shame Capone in the open. During their raids on Capone's breweries and other alcohol operations, the untouchables seized about 45 trucks of various types, most of them new. The government signed a contract for a new warehouse to store the vehicles, which would eventually be sold at auction. Until then, the trucks had to be moved to the new warehouse. Ness came up with a psychological blow to Capone, something few dared to do. He had all the trucks polished to a high shine, then organized a group of drivers to take the convoy. When everything was ready, Ness made his boldest move. He called Capone's headquarters at the Lexington Hotel and insisted on speaking with Capone himself. "Well, Snorky," he said, using a nickname only Capone's close friends used, "I just want to tell you that if you look out your window at exactly 11 o'clock on Michigan Avenue, you'll see something that may interest you." "What's that?" Capone asked, curious. "Just look and you'll see," Ness answered, and hung up. The truck convoy approached Capone's headquarters at the Lexington at exactly 11 a.m., driving very slowly. They passed by Capone's gangsters, gathered in front of the hotel. Ness could see wild gestures and confusion on Capone's balcony. He had certainly managed to enrage Capone with this stunt. Right after the parade, Capone paced his suite furiously, shouting and smashing things. Ness had not only made him angry, but more importantly delivered a significant blow to his business. Millions of dollars worth of brewing equipment were seized or destroyed. Thousands of gallons of beer and liquor were poured out, and the biggest breweries shut down. Wiretaps on Capone's lieutenants showed how bad things were getting. A mob had to cut back on payoffs to policemen. Beer had to be brought in from other areas to supply customers who previously bought Capone's beer. Things got even worse when the Untouchables busted a large operation that produced 20,000 gallons of beer a day. Finally, the government's mission began approaching its end in early spring of 1931, facing a 6-year statute of limitations on the early tax evidence. The government had to move against the year 1924 before March 15, 1931, just days before the deadline. On March 13th, a federal grand jury met in secret to consider claims that Al Capone owed $32,488 in taxes for 1924. An indictment was issued and kept secret while the investigation for 1925 to 1929 continued. On June 5, 1931, the grand jury met again and returned an indictment with 22 counts of tax evasion, totaling over $200,000. A week later, a third indictment was issued based on evidence provided by Elliot Ness and the Untouchables. Capone and 68 members of his gang were charged with about 5,000 separate violations of the law. Some of these went back as far as 1922. However, the tax cases took priority over the prohibition violations. If the government fully prevailed, Capone faced up to 34 years in prison. His lawyers offered U.S. Attorney Johnson a deal. Capone would plead guilty in exchange for a relatively light sentence. After talking with Irie and the new Treasury Secretary, Ogden Mills, Johnson accepted and agreed to recommend a sentence of 2 to 5 years. Why would the government accept such a light sentence after all that effort? First, despite extraordinary measures to protect Shumway and Reyes, there was real concern they might not live long enough to testify. Capone had put a $50,000 bounty on each of their heads. Second, there was doubt the Supreme Court would uphold the 6-year statute of limitations, since one appeals court had already ruled in favor of a 3-year limit on tax evasion. Finally, there was the huge risk of jury tampering through bribery or intimidation. When news of the plea deal leaked, the press was outraged that Capone would get off so lightly. On June 16th, Capone entered the courtroom looking rather pleased. When he pled guilty, Judge James Wilkerson postponed sentencing until June 30th. Capone told reporters he was considering studio offers to make a film about his life. He was in excellent spirits when he appeared before the judge at the end of the month. Judge Wilkerson had a little surprise for him. The parties to a criminal action cannot stipulate as to the sentence to be imposed, he said firmly. He made it clear that although he would listen to Johnson's recommendation, he was not bound by it. It's time someone informed the defendant that it is utterly impossible to bargain with the federal court. It was a huge shock for Capone. The plea deal had collapsed, and he was clearly worried. He was allowed to withdraw his guilty plea, and the trial was set for October 6th. Capone spent the summer at liberty in his old hideout in Lansing, Michigan, seemingly resigned to standing trial. Behind the scenes, however, his organization obtained a list of potential jurors and began bribing them in every possible way. Wilson found out about the bribery and went to Judge Wilkerson with evidence that Capone was buying and threatening prospective jurors. Wilkerson was neither surprised nor alarmed. "Present your case as scheduled," he said, "and leave the rest to me." On October 6, 1931, 14 detectives escorted Capone to the federal courthouse. Security was extremely tight, and Capone was brought in through a tunnel and the freight elevator. His very arrival was a show in itself. Al Capone, the powerful head of the Chicago mob, was dressed in a conservative blue suit, without his usual flashy jewelry. All the major newspapers sent their best reporters to cover the trial. The question everyone put to Capone was, "Are you worried?" "Worried?" Capone would answer with a smile. Well, who wouldn't be? And indeed, he was smiling, in good spirits, and quite confident. He believed his organization had gotten to the jury, and that all he had to do was show up every day, behave politely, and show respect for the court, until his, as he believed, inevitable acquittal. He was already planning that, once acquitted, he would generously tell the press there were no hard feelings, and that the government had simply been doing its job. Then Judge Wilkerson entered the courtroom, not wearing his robe over his dark suit. "Judge Edwards is beginning another trial today," he announced. "Take his entire jury to his courtroom and bring me his jury." Everyone was shocked. No one more than Capone and his lawyer Michael Ahern. The new jury, mostly white men from rural areas, were people who had never been on Capone's lists and had not been bribed. These jurors were sequestered at night, so the mob couldn't get to them. On October 17th, Prosecutor Johnson delivered his closing argument to the jurors, men who shared his agricultural roots. After his introduction, he turned directly toward Capone. "I am puzzled by the way the defense has tried to throw a halo of mystery and romance around the head of this man. Who is he? Who is this man who, in the years we have considered here, has spent so extravagantly nearly $500,000? Is he the little boy out of the Reader who found a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow? Or is he, as his counsel says, a Robin Hood? But did this Robin Hood buy $8,000 diamond belt buckles to give to his employees? No doubt was it Robin Hood who paid $6,500 for meat? Did that go to the employees? No, it went to the house on Palm Island. Did he buy these $27 shirts to protect the shivering people who sleep under Wacker Drive at night? No. That night, after 9 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Capone was found guilty on some of the tax evasion counts, but not all. The following Saturday, Judge Wilkerson sentenced Capone to 11 years in prison, a $50,000 fine, and about $30,000 in court costs. Bail was denied, and he was taken to the Cook County Jail to await transfer to a federal prison. Though all this was unexpected, Capone tried to smile, but his smile was now bitter. He licked his thick lips, his feet moved nervously, and his tongue rolled inside his cheek. He tried to look nonchalant, but he really seemed on the verge of a breakdown. It was a truly heavy blow for the mafia boss. As Capone left the courtroom, IRS officials placed liens on his property so the government could collect its tax claims. Capone lost control and tried to attack one of them, but the marshals guarding him held him back. "Well, I'm going to serve 11 years, Capone said, looking at Elliot Ness. "I gotta do it. That's that. I'm not sore at anybody. Some people are lucky. I just wasn't. There were too many overhead expenses in my business. Anyway, always paying out and replacing trucks and breweries. They ought to make it legal. If it were legal, you sure wouldn't want anything to do with it," Ness told him as he walked away, seeing him for the last time. When the sentence came down in 1931 and Al Capone ended up behind bars, many believed his story was over, but Chicago was not left without a master. The men who had long stood in his shadow continued to pull the strings. His brother Ralph still controlled Cicero. Paul Ricca made cool decisions from the background. Frank Nitti knew how to run the business, and Jack Guzik kept bribing politicians and removing obstacles. While Capone watched his world collapse from prison, little changed in the streets. His fame began to fade, but the network he built kept living and ruling the city. Proof that the mafia never depends on a single man. That same year in New York, Masseria and Maranzano were killed, and the old boss of bosses system disappeared forever. In Chicago, however, Capone's network had already sunk deep roots. The men who had been seen as shadow figures proved that they knew how to rule. Al had been the face on front pages, but the real power remained behind him. His fame faded while the organization continued to live and rule the city. And now we'll tell you an incredible and little-known story about Capone's family. His oldest brother, James Vincenzo Capone, left his home in Brooklyn at age 16 in 1908. Always strong-willed and independent, he wanted to escape the overcrowded tenements and head west, where opportunities seemed better. Strong, muscular, and eager for adventure, he joined a circus and traveled across the Midwest. For the first time, he encountered Native Americans and was fascinated by their culture. When World War I began, James enlisted in the army and was sent to France with the American Expeditionary Forces. He proved to be an excellent marksman and a good soldier and was promoted to lieutenant. He was the only one of the Capone brothers of that generation to serve in World War I after the war. James arrived in the small town of Homer, Nebraska, where in 1919 he rescued Kathleen Winch and her family during a flood. They soon married, and James, who now called himself Richard Hart, began a family life. However, his need for excitement and adventure led him to a new career. Prohibition came into effect in 1920, and Hart saw an opportunity for an interesting job where his shooting skills would be useful. He became a prohibition agent, gaining fame for catching lawbreakers. Incredibly, while his younger brother Al Capone was becoming a legendary bootlegger in Chicago, his older brother was becoming known for busting illegal stills in Nebraska. Hart wasn't just a prohibition agent. He kept order in that frontier region, often arresting horse thieves and other criminals. As his reputation as a lawman grew, he was hired by the U.S. Indian Service to prevent alcohol from entering Native American reservations. With his wife Kathleen and their 4 sons, Hart settled among tribes such as the Sioux and Cheyenne, forming close ties with tribal leaders and learning their language. His skill with weapons and a pair of pearl-handled pistols earned him the nickname Two-Gun Hart, while Al and Ralph Capone filled the newspapers for completely different reasons. Hart was known as a protector of the law. At one point, he even served as a bodyguard to President Calvin Coolidge. After Prohibition was repealed, Hart became chief of police in Homer, Nebraska. Although he was a dedicated family man, he kept his true past secret for years. Only in the early 1940s did he quietly contact his brothers and visit his mother in Chicago, revealing to his wife and children that he was Al Capone's brother. In 1946, Hart took his son Harry Hart to the family cabin in Wisconsin, where the boy had the chance to meet his famous uncle Al Capone, who had already been released from prison but suffered from advanced syphilis. Hart warned his son not to get too close to Al, knowing how different their lives had been. Two-Gun Hart died of a heart attack in 1952 in Homer, Nebraska, with his wife Kathleen and son Harry by his side. His eldest son, Richard Hart Jr., was killed in World War II, while his remaining two sons lived in Wisconsin. It's hard to believe that two brothers, Richard Hart and Al Capone, led such different lives on opposite sides of the law. Yet if you look closely at the qualities that made each brother successful in his world, you can see similarities: intelligence, initiative, risk-taking, willpower, persistence, and the ability to lead and persuade others. Most strangely of all, it was the Prohibition law that brought out those qualities in both brothers. After the guilty verdict, Al Capone was first sent to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, where he soon became its most famous inmate. Almost immediately, accusations surfaced that he lived like a king, though they were exaggerated. Clearly, he had better treatment than other prisoners: more shirts, more underwear, more bedding. He maintained this extra comfort thanks to a hollow handle in his tennis racket, where he hid several $1,000s. In 1934, Attorney General Homer Cummings took control of the prison on Alcatraz Island to isolate dangerous and hardened criminals. In a radio address, he announced that prisoners of vicious and irredeemable character would be isolated there so that their bad influence could not spread to other inmates. In August 1934, Capone was transferred to Alcatraz. His days of privileged treatment in prison were over. Capone would control nothing in or out of Alcatraz. He wouldn't even know what was happening in the outside world. No smuggled letters or messages. Capone's wife, May, tried to avoid reporters when she visited him on Alcatraz. Letters were strictly censored, and all incoming and outgoing mail was copied by guards, with banned topics including anything that might mention business or former associates. Newspapers were forbidden, and magazines had to be at least 7 months old. Inmates could write only one letter a week, and only to immediate family. Visits were allowed only for family members, twice a month, with written permission from the warden. Capone had no access to money, nor could he spend it even if he had it. Capone coped reasonably well with the loss of popularity and status, but his health did not follow that calm trajectory. The syphilis he had contracted as a very young man had progressed into the 1938. He was disoriented and confused. He spent the last year of his sentence reduced to 6 years and 5 months for good behavior in the prison hospital ward being treated for syphilis. He was released in November 1939, and his wife May took him to a hospital in Baltimore, where he stayed until March 1940. Capone's son, Sonny Capone, despite his unusual childhood, was a well-adjusted and friendly young man. In 1940, he married an Irish woman and settled in Miami, although he was the son of one of the most famous gangsters in history. Sonny led a relatively quiet and withdrawn life. He avoided crime and tried to live a completely normal life, far from his father's legacy. He changed his last name to Brown to avoid being associated with his father and went on to live as a salesman. He was not involved in criminal activity and, according to available records, had no trouble with the law. Thanks to the name change and the private life they led, his family managed to stay outside the shadow of his father's criminal past. Al Capone spent his final years in his Palm Island villa, slowly deteriorating. May stayed by his side until his death from a heart attack on January 25, 1947, at the age of 48, while his family mourned at his side. A week before his death, Andrew Volstead, author of the Volstead Act that brought in Prohibition, also died in his 48 years. Capone left a deep mark on Chicago's criminal enterprises and, more than anyone else, showed the absurdity of prohibition, making a huge fortune along the way. At the same time, he captured and held the imagination of the American public by redefining crime as an organized enterprise modeled on corporate business. As he himself often pointed out, many of his crimes were relative. Bootlegging was criminal only because the law said so, and then those same laws were changed. And we can agree that bootlegging alcohol is indeed a minor crime. But we cannot say the same for the hundreds of murders that accompanied the life, rise and fall of the great Al Capone.